In 2007, a team of neuroscientists at Columbia University conducted an experiment that quietly upended everything the self-help industry had been selling for 3 decades. They discovered that the part of your brain generating your most powerful emotional responses, the amygdala, operates on a processing cycle approximately 200 milliseconds faster than the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational decision-making. What this means, in plain terms, is that you feel before you think, every time, without exception. And if you have never been taught what to do with that 200 millisecond gap, your emotions have been making your most consequential decisions for you and calling it your judgment. This is not a minor inefficiency. It is the primary mechanism by which human potential is systematically suppressed, not by external circumstance, not by lack of opportunity, but by a neurological process most people never learn to consciously engage. Today we dismantle it. The scientific field of affective neuroscience, the study of how emotion shapes cognition and behavior, has produced a body of research over the past 2 decades that is simultaneously the most important and most underutilized knowledge available to anyone serious about human performance. Its core finding is this: emotional states are not neutral weather conditions moving through a passive system. They are active cognitive filters that determine which information your brain processes, which options it makes available to conscious awareness, and which behavioral strategies it considers viable. When you are operating under the influence of fear, your brain is not just generating a feeling. It is literally narrowing the range of actions you can perceive as possible. Psychologists call this tunnel cognition, and it is why people consistently make their worst decisions at the moments when accurate decision-making matters most. The critical distinction that most people are never given is this: emotional experience and emotional governance are two entirely separate capacities. The first is automatic, neurological, and universal. Every human being with an intact limbic system will experience fear, doubt, grief, and uncertainty in response to appropriate stimuli. This is not weakness. It is biology. The second capacity, governance, is learned, practiced, and in the early stages, profoundly uncomfortable. It is the trained ability to observe an emotional state without being operationally consumed by it, to register the signal without outsourcing your next decision to it. This distinction is the entire difference between a life driven by reactive emotional cycles and a life built through deliberate, disciplined execution. Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor, military commander, and one of the most studied practitioners of Stoic philosophy in recorded history, maintained a private journal during some of the most politically and personally demanding years of his reign. The journals, which we know today as the Meditations, are not a record of victories. They are a daily practice of cognitive recalibration, a systematic discipline of examining his own emotional responses, separating the judgment embedded in those responses from the observable facts of his situation, and deliberately choosing his interpretive framework before choosing his actions. He was, by modern psychological definition, practicing what cognitive behavioral therapy would formalize 19 centuries later as cognitive reappraisal. The technique works. The clinical evidence for its efficacy is extensive. The operational challenge is that it requires daily practice under pressure, and pressure is precisely when most people abandon every discipline they've built. The first structural principle of emotional mastery is one that runs directly counter to popular wellness culture. Emotional suppression and emotional governance are not the same thing, and confusing them is strategically dangerous. Suppression, the attempt to prevent an emotional state from being experienced, does not eliminate the emotion's influence on cognition and behavior. Research by Harvard psychologist Daniel Wegner established what he called the ironic process theory. The deliberate suppression of a thought or feeling reliably increases its psychological presence and its influence on subsequent behavior. The white bear you try not to think about is the one that dominates your mental landscape. Suppression does not neutralize emotional interference. It drives it underground, where it continues to operate outside of conscious oversight, which is, by definition, the worst possible condition for a state that is actively shaping your decisions. Governance operates differently. It begins with precise acknowledgement, not indulgence acknowledgement. The practice of accurately labeling an emotional state, a process neuroscientists call affect labeling, has been demonstrated in multiple peer-reviewed studies to measurably reduce amygdala activation. The act of naming what you are experiencing with clinical specificity engages the prefrontal cortex and begins to restore the executive processing capacity that heightened emotional arousal has temporarily compromised. You are not performing positivity, you are executing a neurological interrupt, inserting the conscious mind back into a process that had temporarily been running without it. What follows acknowledgement is the critical step most frameworks skip entirely: interpretive reframing. Not manufactured optimism, not denial of difficulty, but a deliberate examination of whether the cognitive interpretation generating the emotional response is the most accurate interpretation available given the full evidence. Fear of failure, for example, is almost never a response to a neutral assessment of risk. It is a response to a narrative about what failure means, specifically, what it means about your identity, your worth, and your future. The failure event itself is data. The catastrophic interpretation of that data is a story. And stories, unlike neurological responses, can be interrogated, revised, and replaced with more accurate ones. The reason this matters strategically is that the narrative you apply to any experience is not merely a psychological comfort mechanism. It is a functional determinant of your subsequent behavioral options. Research by Stanford psychologist Kelly McGonigal on stress physiology demonstrated that individuals who interpreted physiological stress responses, elevated heart rate, heightened alertness, accelerated breathing, as performance preparation signals rather than danger signals showed measurably superior executive function, better decision-making, and significantly lower cortisol-related health consequences than individuals who interpreted identical physiological states as threatening. Same physical experience. Completely different cognitive interpretation, completely different outcomes, measurable in both performance and biology. This is the architecture of what peak performers across every discipline have practiced, often intuitively, without the clinical language to describe it. The elite athlete who channels pre-competition anxiety into focused activation. The surgeon who converts the weight of high-stakes responsibility into precision rather than paralysis. The entrepreneur who processes market rejection as directional intelligence rather than existential verdict. They are not experiencing less emotion than their less successful counterparts. They are processing it differently, and that processing difference is a trained skill, not an innate trait. If this level of evidence-based analysis of human performance and psychological mastery is the content you're searching for, Strategic World Insights is the channel dedicated to exactly this depth of strategic insight. Subscribe now so you never miss a framework that could change how you operate. The concept of emotional weather is one of the most functionally useful frameworks in applied psychology, and it deserves a precise articulation. Emotions are transient neurochemical states, time-limited, context-dependent, and responsive to both internal and external variables that frequently have nothing to do with the actual circumstances you are navigating. Chronic sleep deprivation, low blood glucose, ambient noise levels, postural dynamics, and prior emotional residue from unrelated experiences all measurably influence the emotional coloring of your moment-to-moment experience. This means that a significant portion of the emotional data you are using to make decisions about your capabilities, your prospects, and your direction has nothing to do with an accurate assessment of those things. It is neurochemical noise, and you have been mistaking it for signal. The practitioner who understands this stops asking, "How do I feel about this decision?" as a primary data source and starts asking a more sophisticated question: what do the facts of this situation indicate, independent of my current affective state? This is not emotional coldness. It is epistemic discipline, the same discipline a scientist applies when they recognize that their investment in a particular hypothesis must not be permitted to distort their interpretation of the experimental data. You are the scientist. Your life is the experiment, and the data deserves to be read accurately. Failure deserves particular attention here because the emotional processing of failure is where the most consequential divergence between high performers and stagnating individuals occurs. Research in achievement psychology consistently identifies what Carol Dweck's team termed learned helplessness cascades, the process by which repeated failures, interpreted through a fixed identity framework, progressively erode the individual's willingness to engage with challenging tasks. Each failure is registered not as information about the approach, but as evidence about the person. And as that evidence accumulates, the emotional cost of attempting becomes prohibitive. The individual stops entering situations where failure is possible, which means they stop entering situations where growth is possible, which means the very self-protection mechanism designed to manage the pain of failure guarantees the permanent absence of the success that would make the pain worthwhile. The reframe is not inspirational, it is analytical. Failure is a mechanism by which a complex system, in this case a human being pursuing a goal in a complex environment, receives high-fidelity feedback about the gap between current capability and required capability. That gap is not shameful. It is a technical specification. It tells you exactly what to develop, exactly where the work is, exactly what the next phase of preparation requires. The individuals who have produced the most significant results in any field are not distinguished by low failure rates. They are distinguished by high iteration rates, the willingness to receive failure data and return to the attempt with the intelligence that data provides, faster and more systematically than their peers. Thomas Edison's documented response to the serial failures preceding functional electric light was not emotional resilience in the popular sense. It was methodological clarity, the understanding that each non-functional prototype had successfully eliminated one variable from the solution space, bringing the working solution incrementally closer. That is not a motivational reframe. That is an accurate description of how iterative problem solving actually functions in complex domains. The emotional experience of repeated failure is real. The cognitive interpretation of what that failure means is a choice, and it is the most consequential choice available to anyone in the process of building something significant. Pain, as a category of human experience, has been systematically pathologized by contemporary culture in ways that are strategically counterproductive. The medical and wellness industries have, for obvious commercial reasons, invested heavily in the framing of pain, physical and psychological, as a problem requiring elimination rather than a signal requiring interpretation. The result is a population with sophisticated access to numbing mechanisms and very little practice in the discipline of sitting with discomfort long enough to understand what it is actually communicating. Psychological pain, the specific varieties associated with growth, challenge, loss, and the discomfort of becoming someone different from who you currently are, is not a malfunction. It is, with extraordinary precision, the sensation of a system being asked to operate beyond its current parameters. That is not comfortable. But discomfort at the edge of capability is the only environment in which capability expands. The discipline of remaining present with discomfort, not amplifying it, not dramatizing it, not running from it, and extracting its directional intelligence is one of the most advanced and most undervalued human skills. Ancient contemplative traditions across multiple cultures independently developed formal practices for cultivating exactly this capacity. Modern performance psychology has validated the mechanism they were intuiting. Mindful exposure to discomfort without reactive avoidance progressively raises the threshold at which discomfort triggers behavioral disruption. You become, over time and practice, someone who can operate in conditions that would previously have caused you to shut down, not because the conditions have changed, but because your processed relationship to discomfort has. The language of motivation is one of the most misleading frameworks in popular performance discourse, and its dominance in the self-help industry has produced generations of people with sophisticated emotional expectations and completely underdeveloped behavioral infrastructure. Motivation is, neurologically, an acute dopaminergic state associated with novelty, anticipated reward, and early-stage engagement with a new goal. It is, by its neurochemical nature, temporary. It is highest before you have direct experience with the difficulty of what you are pursuing, and it declines reliably as that difficulty becomes concrete. If you have structured your performance system around the presence of motivation, if you rely on feeling driven, feeling inspired, feeling energized as a prerequisite for productive action, your system is architecturally dependent on a state that your own neurobiology guarantees will be intermittent. Commitment operates through an entirely different mechanism. It is not a feeling. It is a decision, a prior determination about who you are and how you behave that does not take daily instruction from your effective state. Commitment functions like a contract you have made with your future self, one that was executed during a moment of clarity and that continues to govern your behavior during the far more frequent moments of friction, fatigue, and doubt that constitute the actual texture of sustained effort. The individuals who produce transformative results over time are not the ones who feel most motivated. They are the ones who have most deeply internalized the understanding that their behavior cannot be permitted to wait on their feelings. They have decoupled showing up from wanting to show up, and that decoupling is the entire mechanism of sustained performance. Examine the empirical evidence of your own history with the precision you would apply to any other important data set. Every significant challenge you have navigated to this point, every period of genuine difficulty you have survived, every moment when the outcome was uncertain and the emotional experience was genuinely painful, all of it has a common final data point. You are still here. Your personal survival rate is perfect. This is not a trivial observation dressed in inspirational language. It is a statistically significant pattern that should directly inform your current assessment of your own resilience. The emotional mind under pressure generates predictions about future sustainability based on current intensity. Those predictions are systematically inaccurate. The historical record is more reliable. And your historical record says that you have a documented capacity for navigating difficulty that exceeds every estimate your fear has ever offered you. The architecture of genuine transformation does not occur in singular dramatic moments of decision, though those moments have their function. It occurs in the aggregate of small, consistently executed behavioral choices made in the absence of emotional facilitation, in the early morning when no one is watching, in the moment of friction when the easier path is clearly available, in the sustained commitment to process during the extended intervals when results are not yet visible. These are not cinematic moments. They are not emotionally rewarding in the immediate term. They are the unglamorous operational substance of every significant life ever built. The transformation accumulates in them invisibly, the way compound interest accumulates, unremarkably, until suddenly, at a threshold that appears sudden only to outside observers, the result becomes undeniable. The most precise formulation of emotional mastery, grounded in everything the research supports, is this: you are not your emotional states. You are the cognitive system that observes, processes, and responds to them. The emotions are information passing through a system that is larger than they are. When that system has been trained, through consistent practice, under real conditions with genuine stakes, to receive emotional data without being governed by it, the range of action available to that system expands dramatically. Not because circumstances have changed, not because the emotions have disappeared, but because the relationship between feeling and behavior has been fundamentally restructured. That restructuring is a project. It requires time, sustained practice, and the willingness to operate imperfectly during the long period when the new patterns are being built and the old ones still have considerable momentum. There will be days when the emotional weather wins. There will be regression. This is not evidence that the process is failing. It is evidence that the process is real, that you are building something that has weight and resistance, not just performing a new vocabulary. The question that deserves to follow you out of this analysis and into every day that comes after is not, how do I feel about this? It is a harder and more important question. Who have I decided to be? And does this action, taken right now, in this moment, in the presence of this discomfort, honor that decision? Because that question, asked with discipline and answered with integrity across thousands of unremarkable moments over months and years, is the precise mechanism by which an extraordinary life is constructed from an ordinary morning. The emotions will continue to offer their testimony. The question is whether you will continue to let them serve as judge.